She was shamed, disowned, and forgotten, until the Duke's love turned her into the most feared woman in England. London, 1828. Winter light caught the crystal chandeliers of Lady Pemberton's ballroom, when Gloria D. Cramer felt her father's voice sever her from her name with a finality that should not exist in civilized company, not whispered in private corridors, not delivered through sealed correspondence, but proclaimed with the clarity of a man performing an execution before 300 witnesses, dressed in silk and satisfaction. "You are no daughter of mine." The words fell through champagne-scented air like stones through water, and Gloria watched her surname stripped away as methodically as pearls from a broken strand. At 24, she knew which curtsies would earn approval, which silences would be mistaken for grace, which strategic smiles would transform rejection into reconsideration. But she had never heard her identity dismantled in real time, syllable by syllable, as though the 24 years she'd spent as Baron Cramer's daughter could be erased by a single declaration before the aristocracy's hungriest spectators. She stood frozen on the ballroom floor, her fingers gripping her own arms until her nails bit through evening gloves. Through the tall windows, the winter night waited beyond the candlelight's reach streets, where women without names learned survival had no room for dignity, where the disowned became the disappeared. Gloria had always belonged somewhere. She was the woman whose needlework won compliments, the daughter invited to recite poetry, admired enough to attract proposals, valuable enough that her refusal of one should never have cost her everything. The ballroom's silence shattered, not with gasps, society was far too practiced for that, but with the whisper of fans unfurling, the rustle of skirts turning away, the sound of 300 people choosing, in perfect choreographed cruelty, to pretend she'd already vanished. Lady Pemberton's smile gleamed from across the room, sharp as the diamonds at her throat. Lord Harrington, the violent Earl Gloria had refused, stood beside the Baron, with an expression that confirmed what she'd always suspected. Her rejection had been less an insult to his pride than a challenge to his ownership, and now he'd watch her punishment as though it were theatre commissioned for his amusement. "You will leave," her father continued, and his voice carried something Gloria had never heard directed at her before. Contempt. "With nothing. As you deserve." Gloria's breath stopped. Nothing for her. Her dowry, her inheritance, her home, everything she'd been promised since birth, everything she'd been raised to expect as birthright, dissolved like sugar in rain. Her heart struck once against her ribs, hard, accusatory, as if she'd committed some unforgivable transgression by believing that her choice mattered more than her compliance. Then it seemed to resume beating in a different rhythm entirely, suspended in the thick silence of expensive perfume and collective judgment, because daughters were not disowned in ballrooms by accident, and fathers did not destroy their children's futures unless they believed those children had already destroyed something more valuable: reputation, family honor, the unspoken contract that women existed to be arranged rather than autonomous. If you love stories where shamed women weaponize their survival, where scandal becomes strategy, and where love demands we choose ourselves first, stay with Gloria's resurrection. Your presence here matters, and I'd love to know, where in the world are you reading from? These stories of transformation travel further than the societies that try to silence them. Gloria D. Cramer did not know what survival beyond scandal looked like. She knew only what society had taught her, that a woman's value resided in her marriageability, that refusal was rebellion, that rebellion was ruin. No one had prepared her for the weight of pearls around her neck as she walked through a silent ballroom toward a winter night that promised nothing but erasure. She grew up among privilege and protocol, learning to dance from expensive masters, to negotiate from careful observation, to exist as ornament and asset simultaneously. She had a dowry measured in thousands, prospects that arrived in sealed letters, confirmation that her birth had registered as valuable to everyone who mattered. Her only inheritance, she'd believed, was the certainty that obedience would be rewarded with security. She'd been wrong. At 16, she'd first noticed Lord Harrington's hands, how they gripped rather than held, possessed rather than touched. By 20, She'd perfected the art of strategic distance at social functions. When the engagement was announced without her consent, 3 weeks before the winter ball, she'd done what no one expected. She'd said no. Not quietly, not with apologies or negotiations. Simply, no. That word cost her everything. Gloria descended Lady Pemberton's marble staircase for the last time, her pulse beating a rhythm foreign to aristocratic composure. This wasn't shame. Shame was a luxury for women who still had futures to protect. This was something colder, sharper the moment before transformation, when you realize the woman you were has already died, and the woman you'll become hasn't yet learned to breathe. The winter air bit through her evening gown as the ballroom doors closed behind her with the finality of a crypt ceiling. She had 3 months to learn what forgotten felt like. Then a duke would find her in a workshop that smelled of wool and coal smoke, and ask not, "What happened to you?" but "What do you know about estate law?" And Gloria D. Cramer, the woman who'd been publicly erased, would discover that disappearance was just another form of preparation for the resurrection no one saw coming. The workshop smelled of wool and coal smoke, and the particular dampness that clung to buildings where sunlight arrived as rumor rather than fact. Gloria found it on her 4th night of searching, when hunger had begun to hollow out the space beneath her ribs, and the pearls she'd worn to her own execution had been sold to a pawnbroker who'd looked at her evening gown and asked no questions she could answer. Mrs. Webb hired her on sight. Not from charity, the widow's face carried the exhaustion of a woman who'd survived too much to waste energy on sympathy, but from the practical calculation that Gloria's hands, despite their trembling, could hold a needle steady enough to be useful. "Name?" Mrs. Webb had asked, her voice flat as the grey London sky visible through cracked windows. Gloria's throat had closed around the surname that no longer belonged to her. "Grace," she'd said finally, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The lie tasted like survival. She learned quickly that precision was the only currency that mattered here. The other seamstresses worked with competent efficiency, their stitches adequate, their hems functional. Gloria made each seam a small act of warfare against the chaos her life had become. If she could control thread and needle, if she could force wool to submit to geometric perfection, then perhaps she could prove that some part of her remained unbroken. The work consumed her. She arrived before dawn and stayed past dusk, her fingers moving with a focus that bordered on obsession. Every perfect stitch was a rebellion, proof that the woman who'd been publicly destroyed in Lady Pemberton's ballroom could still create something flawless, still impose order on fabric, when her own existence had been torn apart at the seams. Mrs. Webb watched this transformation with the same flat neutrality she applied to everything. She paid Gloria weekly in coins that smelled of copper and desperation. She asked no questions about the way Grace flinched at sudden sounds, or why a woman who stitched with mathematical precision sometimes stared at her own hands as though they belonged to someone else. The other seamstresses gossiped during lunch about bows and debts, petty scandals and smaller dreams. Gloria learned to make herself small during these moments, to occupy the corner of the workshop where shadows pooled thickest. She perfected the art of invisibility, eyes down, voice soft when forced to speak, movements economical enough to avoid drawing attention. She became a ghost who happened to be useful, forgettable enough to keep, invisible enough to survive. At night, in the boarding house room she rented with her meager wages, Gloria unpicked every assumption she'd carried about her own value. She'd believed her worth resided in her name, her dowry, her place in society's careful architecture. Now she understood that she'd never been valuable at all, only expensive, and expensive things could be discarded the moment they refused to perform their designated function. 3 months passed like this. 3 months of becoming Grace, of perfecting invisibility, of learning that survival required the complete erasure of everything she'd once been. Then the Duke walked into Mrs. Webb's workshop, and Gloria's resurrection began. Rodolfo C. Durant entered Mrs. Webb's workshop the way wealth always entered spaces built for labor, with an assumption of welcome that required no invitation. His coat, charcoal wool with silver buttons that caught the weak afternoon light, had been mended 3 days prior. a torn seam repaired with stitches so precise they'd become invisible. Gloria heard his footsteps before she saw him. Measured, confident, belonging to someone who'd never learned to make himself small. She kept her eyes on the hem she was turning, her needle moving through fabric with the mechanical rhythm she'd perfected over 3 months of erasure. Dukes did not notice seamstresses. Invisibility was safety. Mrs. Webb emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron, her voice taking on the particular brightness reserved for customers who paid in pound notes rather than shillings. Your Grace, the coat is ready. The repair is seamless, as promised. I can see that. His voice was deeper than Gloria expected, carrying education and authority in equal measure. The craftsmanship is exceptional. Who did the work? Gloria's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before resuming their rhythm. She did not look up. Grace handled it. Your Grace. She's got quite the hand for detail. The silence that followed felt weighted. Gloria could feel his attention shift, but she kept her focus trained on her needle, on the mathematical precision of each stitch, on the art of being overlooked. Mrs. Webb, your accounting ledger is incorrect. The widow's voice sharpened with defensiveness. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but I've kept these books for 15 years. The column totals don't match your recorded expenses. You're short by £3, 7 shillings. Gloria's jaw tightened. She'd noticed the error 2 days ago while organizing Mrs. Webb's chaotic desk. The widow's arithmetic was adequate for daily operations but collapsed under any sustained scrutiny. Gloria had corrected it quietly. Her years of managing household accounts, back when she'd had a household, making the work instinctive. That's impossible, Mrs. Webb said, but her certainty wavered. Gloria set down her needle. The words emerged before wisdom could stop them. The error was in Tuesday's fabric purchase. The invoice listed 4 yards at 6 shillings each, but you recorded it as 5 yards. I corrected it yesterday. The workshop went silent. She'd spoken. Worse, she'd revealed competence beyond needle and thread, had demonstrated the kind of casual expertise that belonged to educated women who managed estates, not to seamstresses named Grace, who existed in corners and shadows. Gloria finally looked up and found the Duke of Blackthorn studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with recognition. His eyes, dark, analytical, missing nothing, traveled across her face with the systematic assessment of someone solving a complex equation. Grace, he said slowly, testing the name like a coin of uncertain authenticity. Then, with devastating precision, or should I say Miss Cramer, the needle slipped from her fingers and struck the floor with a sound like a small bone breaking. He knew. Mrs. Webb had the sense to disappear into the back room, her footsteps quick and strategic. The other seamstresses found urgent business elsewhere. Gloria stood alone in the workshop's grey light, facing a man who'd just spoken her real name like an accusation she couldn't refute. I don't know what you mean, Your Grace. The lie came automatically, a reflex born from 3 months of survival. You corrected a £3 accounting error in seconds. You stitch with mathematical precision, and you have the posture of a woman trained to manage a household, despite wearing a dress that's been let out twice to accommodate weight you've lost. Rodolfo's voice carried no cruelty, only observation. You're the daughter Baron Cramer disowned at Lady Pemberton's winter ball. I was there. Gloria's throat tightened. Of course he'd been there. 300 witnesses had watched her destruction. She'd simply learned not to count them individually. Then you know I'm no one worth your attention, Your Grace. On the contrary. He stepped closer, and she forced herself not to retreat. I know you refused Lord Harrington, despite understanding the consequences. I know you walked out of that ballroom with more dignity than the 300 people who stayed behind. And I know you're wasting extraordinary intelligence on survival when you could be using it for something that matters. The words landed like blows, not because they were cruel, but because they acknowledged what she'd spent 3 months trying to forget, that she'd once been capable of more than disappearing. What do you want? Her voice came out sharper than intended, stripped of the deference Grace would have shown. An alliance. Rodolfo's directness felt dangerous, like standing too close to something that could burn. I need an estate strategist and political advisor. Someone who understands aristocratic machinery well enough to dismantle it. Someone brilliant enough to see patterns others miss, and invisible enough that no one will suspect they're being outmaneuvered by a woman society has already forgotten. Gloria's heart struck against her ribs. You want me to work for you, with me, as my ward, publicly, privately, as the architect of every strategic decision I make. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. You'll live at Blackthorn Manor. Your identity remains protected. Your work remains invisible. But your mind finally gets used for what it was meant to do. She should have felt gratitude. Instead, she felt hunger, sharp and consuming, the first real appetite she'd experienced since that winter night 3 months ago. This wasn't rescue. This was purpose offered like a weapon she could finally use. Why me? The question emerged raw, unpolished by strategy. Because at that ball, you chose yourself over safety. That kind of courage is rare. His gaze held steady. And because intelligence like yours doesn't disappear just because society stops acknowledging it. Gloria looked at her hands, calloused now, scarred by needle pricks and survival. Then she looked back at the Duke of Blackthorn and made her second act of rebellion. I accept. Not because I need saving, Your Grace, but because I need something worth doing. His smile was brief, sharp, approving. Then we understand each other perfectly. Blackthorn Manor's study smelled of leather and old paper and the particular silence that wealth could purchase. Gloria stood before Rodolfo's desk 3 days after her arrival, her borrowed dress still too fine for someone who'd spent months perfecting invisibility, her hands no longer trembling when she touched expensive things. The documents spread before her told a story society would call business. Gloria saw it for what it was: theft, dressed in legal language. Lord Pemberton is acquiring land in Yorkshire, Rodolfo said, watching her scan the contracts with the intensity of someone testing a blade's sharpness. 3 estates in 6 months. The owners claim they sold willingly, but the pattern suggests otherwise. Gloria's finger traced the signature lines, the dates, the careful architecture of coercion. She'd managed her father's estate correspondence for years before her fall had learned to read what men left unwritten, to see manipulation in the gaps between words. He's not buying. He's cornering. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for knowing things. Look at the timing. Each sale occurs within days of the owner facing sudden debt that appears in loan agreements with Pemberton's bank 2 months prior. Rodolfo leaned forward. He's lending them money, then calling the loans, and offering to purchase their land at reduced value as the only alternative to complete ruin. Gloria pulled 3 contracts together, her mind assembling the pattern with the same precision she'd once applied to needlework. It's elegant, really, legal enough to withstand scrutiny, cruel enough to be effective. Can it be stopped? The question hung in the air between them. This was the moment, the test, that would determine whether she was merely intelligent or actually dangerous. Gloria felt something shift inside her chest, some final barrier between survival and power dissolving like sugar in rain. She reached for blank paper, her hand steady. It can be destroyed. For the next 2 hours, Gloria drafted a counter-strategy that made Rodolfo's study feel too small for what she was unleashing. She identified the loan agreement's legal vulnerabilities, the witnesses who could testify to coercion, the banking regulations Pemberton had violated in his certainty that no one would look closely enough to notice. She constructed a web of evidence and legal maneuvering so precise that it would force Pemberton to not only release his victims, but compensate them for their losses. The final document was 15 pages of systematic destruction, dressed in legal courtesy. Gloria set down her pen and looked up to find Rodolfo staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not surprise, something sharper, more dangerous. Recognition mixed with something that looked almost like caution. This isn't defense, he said quietly. This is annihilation. Yes. Gloria met his gaze without flinching. Did you expect anything less? A slow smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that acknowledged he'd miscalculated, but in the most fascinating way possible. I expected intelligence, Miss Cramer. What you've shown me is warfare. Good. She straightened. and for the first time since that winter ball, she felt like herself. Then, let's begin. The collapse happened on a Thursday afternoon, precisely when London's financial district was most crowded with men who believed their positions were unassailable. Gloria watched from Blackthorn Manor's study window as a messenger arrived with the news, his horse lathered from the speed of scandal traveling faster than conscience. She'd spent 6 weeks orchestrating it, 6 weeks of forged correspondence sent through channels that couldn't be traced, of strategic whispers placed in the ears of merchants who'd suffered under Pemberton's monopoly, of legal documents filed with timing so precise that each revelation built upon the last, like dominoes falling in choreographed sequence. The Yorkshire landowners had filed suit simultaneously. The banking violations had been exposed by an anonymous tip to the financial regulators. The trade contracts Pemberton had leveraged for exclusive import rights had been revealed as fraudulent, signed by officials he'd bribed with money that could now be traced directly to his accounts. By the time London's aristocracy understood what was happening, Lord Pemberton's empire had already collapsed inward like a building whose foundation had been systematically removed stone by stone. Rodolfo read the messenger's report aloud, his voice carrying notes of something Gloria was learning to recognize as admiration. Pemberton is ruined. Complete financial collapse. The Crown is investigating. His seat in Parliament is in question. He looked up from the paper. Every move he made to build his monopoly has been turned into evidence against him. Yes, Gloria's voice was steady, controlled, carrying none of the satisfaction burning in her chest. He built his power on the assumption that no one would look closely enough to see how he'd constructed it. That assumption was his weakness. They're calling it divine justice, mysterious circumstances. Rodolfo set down the report, and when he looked at her, something had shifted in his expression. No one can identify who orchestrated this. You've made yourself invisible even in victory. That was the strategy. Gloria turned from the window, and for a moment she let him see what she'd been hiding. The cold satisfaction of a woman who'd learned to weaponize her own erasure. They're so busy searching for a man powerful enough to destroy Pemberton, they'll never suspect a disowned daughter working from a duke's study. You're not just intelligent, Rodolfo said, and his tone carried a weight that made the study feel smaller, more charged. You're transformative. This isn't strategy, it's revolution disguised as bookkeeping. Gloria felt something unlock in her chest. For 3 months she'd been Grace, forgettable and invisible. For 6 weeks she'd been Rodolfo's project, his experiment in reclaimed potential. But in this moment, watching him look at her with the recognition reserved for equals rather than protégés, she understood what she'd actually become. Dangerous. Lord Pemberton destroyed families for profit, she said quietly. I simply ensured he paid for it, in the only currency men like him understand. Rodolfo crossed to where she stood, and his smile carried approval sharp enough to cut. What would you like to dismantle next? Gloria thought of the winter ball, of 300 witnesses, of her father's voice severing her from her name. She thought of every woman who'd been erased for refusing to be property. Everything, she said. Eventually. The late nights began as necessity. Gloria's strategies required hours of research, of reading contracts by candlelight until the words blurred, of mapping aristocratic connections like a general studying battlefield terrain. Rodolfo worked beside her, his presence steady and increasingly difficult to ignore. It was past midnight when the professional distance between them finally collapsed. They'd been reviewing marriage contracts, analyzing how property transferred from wives to husbands, how women's wealth disappeared into legal frameworks designed for their erasure. Gloria's handwriting had grown sharp with anger across the margins, her annotations cutting deeper than analysis required. You're not just dismantling corruption, Rodolfo said quietly. You're declaring war on the entire system. Gloria set down her pen, exhaustion making her honest. The system destroyed me for saying no. Yes, I'm declaring war. The silence that followed felt weighted with things unspoken. Rodolfo leaned back in his chair, his expression carrying something she'd never seen before. Vulnerability, perhaps, or the kind of honesty that only emerged after midnight when defenses grew too heavy to maintain. I need to tell you something. His voice was careful, deliberate. I didn't find you by accident at Mrs. Webb's workshop. Gloria's pulse stuttered. What do you mean? I was at Lady Pemberton's ball. I watched you refuse Lord Harrington in front of your father. Watched you choose dignity over safety, even when you understood the cost. He met her gaze without flinching. I saw courage so rare it made everyone else in that ballroom look like cowards. So when your father disowned you, I made inquiries. I wanted to find the woman brave enough to destroy her own life, rather than live it as someone else's property. The words hit like physical blows. Gloria had spent months believing her fall was punishment for transgression, but Rodolfo had witnessed it as something else entirely, as an act worth seeking out, worth valuing. You sought me out because I was ruined. I sought you out because you refused to be diminished. There's a difference. He stood, crossing to where she sat, and his proximity made the study feel impossibly small. I didn't offer you this position from pity, Gloria. I offered it because intelligence like yours, courage like yours, that's what changes worlds. And I wanted to be part of whatever you became next. Gloria's breath caught. He'd used her real name, not Grace, not Miss Cramer, but Gloria. The syllables sounded different in his voice, stripped of shame, weighted with something that felt dangerously close to desire. She should have stepped back, should have reinforced the professional boundaries that had kept this partnership safe. Instead, she looked up at him and spoke the truth she'd been hiding even from herself. I spent 3 months believing I was too stained to be wanted. That shame was permanent. Her voice dropped to something raw, unguarded. But standing here, looking at you, looking at me like that, I'm realizing shame and desire can exist in the same breath. Rodolfo's hand lifted, hesitated, then traced the line of her jaw with devastating gentleness. Then breathe, Gloria. She did. The Ashford political salon occupied 3 interconnected drawing rooms, where London's power brokers gathered monthly to disguise ambition as intellectual discourse. Gloria entered wearing midnight blue silk and a silver mask that covered half her face, her hand resting lightly on Rodolfo's arm, as though she'd been born to aristocratic spaces rather than exiled from them. No one recognized her. Why would they? Gloria D. Cramer had been erased 6 months ago, and the woman who'd replaced her had learned to make erasure into armor. The discussion turned to property law, specifically a proposed reform that would grant wives limited control over inherited assets. The men in the room, politicians, barristers, lords who made policy over brandy, dismissed it with the casual cruelty of people who'd never questioned their authority. Women lack the temperament for financial decisions, Lord Ashford declared, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd never been challenged. Sentiment would override strategy. Gloria felt Rodolfo's arm tense beneath her hand. She squeezed once, a signal they'd developed over late nights in his study. Let me. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through cigar smoke and self-satisfaction. Sentiment didn't override strategy when Queen Elizabeth negotiated with Spain. Temperament didn't fail when the Duchess of Marlborough managed her husband's military finances during the War of Spanish Succession. Her words landed with surgical precision. Perhaps the issue isn't women's capacity for financial decisions, but men's capacity to recognize competence when it doesn't reflect their own faces. The room went silent. Every eye turned toward the masked woman who'd just committed the unforgivable sin of being correct in public. Lord Ashford's face reddened. And you are? Someone who's read the actual proposal you're dismissing, Gloria continued, her tone sharp enough to draw blood, which grants wives control only over assets they inherit directly, not marital property, not their husband's wealth. It's a remarkably conservative reform that simply prevents widows from being immediately dispossessed. Unless you're arguing that dead men should control property better than living women. A younger lord laughed before catching himself. Another nodded slowly, reconsidering. Gloria watched the room's dynamics shift, watched men who'd entered certain of their positions, suddenly questioning foundations they'd never examined. She'd learned this in Rodolfo's study, that power wasn't volume, but precision, the ability to dismantle an argument so completely that reassembling it became impossible. Remarkable, someone murmured. Who is she? Gloria reached for her mask. Rodolfo moved beside her, close enough that his presence read as claim rather than escort. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a question and an answer passing between them without words. She removed the mask. The silence that followed was different than the one at Lady Pemberton's ball. That silence had been predatory, hungry. This one tasted of shock and something sharper. Recognition that the woman they'd watched destroyed had returned as something far more dangerous than a baron's daughter. "Miss Cramer," Lord Ashford whispered, and the name spread through the room like flame through dry timber. "Actually," Rodolfo's voice cut through the spreading whispers with absolute authority, "you'll address her as Lady Blackthorne, my intended bride, and the finest strategic mind in this room." Gloria felt his hand find hers, their fingers intertwining with the deliberate intimacy of a public claiming. She didn't look away from the aristocracy that had watched her fall. Instead, she smiled sharp, unapologetic, daring any of them to question her resurrection. No one did. Cramer House looked smaller than Gloria remembered. The estate that had defined her childhood, its gardens where she'd learned to walk, its library where she'd studied estate management, its ballroom where she'd practiced curtsies that would never earn back her father's approval, had shrunk to the dimensions of a place that could be conquered rather than mourned. The carriage bearing the Blackthorne crest stopped before the entrance. Gloria descended without assistance, Rodolfo following with the measured confidence of a man who'd never questioned his right to occupy space. The butler who answered recognized her instantly, his face draining of color like water from cracked porcelain. "Miss Cramer." "Lady Blackthorne," Rodolfo corrected, his voice carrying authority that made correction unnecessary. "Here to see Baron Cramer. He's expecting us." He wasn't, of course, but men like her father always expected the world to arrange itself around their convenience. Today would teach him otherwise. They found him in his study, the room where he'd once taught her to read contracts, to understand property law, to manage accounts with precision, skills he'd trained into her before deciding she was too defective to use them on his behalf. Baron Cramer stood as they entered, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear, before settling on performative anger. "Gloria, you dare." "I dare quite a bit, father." She set a leather portfolio on his desk with deliberate care. "As you're about to discover." His eyes flicked to the documents, then to Rodolfo, calculating. "The Duke of Blackthorne. I see you've found yourself a protector." "A partner," Gloria corrected, "though I suppose you wouldn't recognize the difference, given how you view women as property to be managed, rather than people to be valued." She opened the portfolio, spreading documents across his desk with the systematic precision of someone presenting evidence at trial. "Bank statements, loan agreements, correspondence. Do you recognize these?" Her voice was cold, clinical. "These are the financial arrangements you made with Lord Harrington. The agreements where you promised him my dowry before ever asking if I'd consent to the marriage. The contracts where you sold your daughter like livestock, complete with delivery terms and penalty clauses for non-compliance." Baron Cramer's face reddened. "That's standard practice. It's trafficking." Gloria's words cut like surgical steel. "But that's not the fascinating part. The fascinating part is what you did after I refused. After you disowned me with such dramatic flair at Lady Pemberton's ball." She laid out more documents. "You kept my dowry, told the solicitors I'd married in secret and forfeited my inheritance, moved those funds into your own accounts within a week of declaring me dead to you. £20,000 that was mine by right, stolen under the pretense of righteousness." Her father's hand trembled as he reached for the papers. "You can't prove." "I can prove everything." Gloria's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Because you taught me to read contracts, father. You trained me to find discrepancies, to trace money through complicated channels, to see patterns others miss. You made me dangerous, then threw me away. That was your mistake." Rodolfo spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of institutional power. "The evidence Miss Cramer, Lady Blackthorne, has compiled will be submitted to the Crown's Financial Oversight Committee. Fraud, embezzlement of a dependent's assets, falsification of legal documents." He paused. "You'll be ruined." Baron Cramer collapsed into his chair, the fight draining from him as he finally understood what Gloria had become in his absence. "What do you want?" Gloria leaned forward, her voice dropping to something intimate and devastating. I want you to know that everything you're about to lose, your reputation, your position, your certainty that you were right to destroy me, you lost the moment you decided I was disposable. I didn't come here for forgiveness, Father. I came to show you exactly what you created when you tried to erase me. She straightened, turning toward the door with Rodolfo beside her. Goodbye, Baron Cramer. I hope obscurity suits you better than it suited me. The wedding took place in Blackthorn Manor's library rather than a church, witnessed by 50 people who mattered rather than 300 who didn't. Gloria wore ivory silk without a veil, her dark hair pulled back to reveal a face that no longer apologized for existing, and she walked to Rodolfo without an escort because she'd spent too long being given away by men who'd never valued what they possessed. The ceremony's first defiance came when the officiant asked for her legal name. Gloria Durant Cramer, she said, her voice steady and unapologetic, not taking Rodolfo's name entirely, not keeping only her father's, but forging something new, a hyphenation that acknowledged partnership without erasure. The second defiance came in the vows she'd written herself, words that made half the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. I marry you not as rescue, but as recognition, not as savior, but as equal. I promise you my mind, my strategy, my transformation of shame into power, and I promise that every woman watching this will know that marriage can be revolution instead of surrender. Rodolfo's answering vows matched hers in precision and defiance. When they sealed their partnership with a kiss, Gloria felt the weight of society's judgment transform into something she could finally weaponize. Proof that the woman they'd tried to erase had not only survived but evolved into something far more dangerous than a baron's obedient daughter. The wedding breakfast became a war council. Gloria stood before assembled members of Parliament, barristers, and reformers, presenting the legislation she and Rodolfo had drafted over months of late-night strategy sessions. She called it the Cramer Doctrine, claiming her father's name for the framework that would systematically dismantle everything he'd represented. The doctrine establishes 3 fundamental protections. Gloria's voice carried through the room with the authority of someone who'd learned to command attention rather than beg for it. First, women retain ownership of inherited property, regardless of marital status. Second, marriage contracts require the bride's witnessed signature, not merely her father's consent. Third, financial arrangements made on a woman's behalf without her knowledge constitute fraud under law. She watched faces shift as the implications registered. This wasn't reform, it was revolution dressed in legal language. The same weapon she'd used to destroy Lord Pemberton's monopoly, now aimed at the entire system of female dispossession. Some will call this radical, Gloria continued, and her smile carried the sharp satisfaction of a woman who'd stopped apologizing for her own existence. I call it justice. Every woman who's been treated as property rather than person, every daughter sold without consent, every wife erased by marriage. This doctrine says their erasure ends now. The vote took 3 hours. When it passed, Gloria felt something fundamental shift in her chest. Not triumph, precisely, but the cold satisfaction of consequence finally catching up to cruelty. That night, standing in Blackthorn Manor's study where her resurrection had begun, Rodolfo found her reviewing correspondence from women across England who'd heard about the doctrine and recognized salvation in legal language. They're calling you the most dangerous woman in England, he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Gloria leaned into his warmth, her eyes still scanning letters from women she'd never met but had somehow saved. Good. Let them fear what happens when they try to erase someone who refuses to disappear. She thought of that winter night 6 months ago, of walking out of Lady Pemberton's ballroom wearing pearls and carrying nothing, of 3 months learning to be invisible, to be grace, to survive on the edges of a world that had expelled her. The woman who'd been shamed had become the woman they feared, not through revenge, but through the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to let shame define her ending. Gloria Durant Cramer had learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that resurrection was just another word for consequence, and consequence always came for those who believed erasure was permanent.